We're starting in on our second major test case, or our second major example of ethics. This one from Immanuel Kant, The Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals. Again, what we're really looking to do with these examples is just look at how someone might put together an attempt at a consistent theory of ethics, something that is ethics in the proper sense, universal, objective, even humanistic in from sense, and also thinking about where the normativity comes from, how the normative question gets answered. So having been through Aristotle, we now set that aside and look at another example now. If you've never read Kant before, obviously, as you saw here, it's a bit of a challenge. Just the language, he's a very dense writer. He doesn't like to fully explain himself sometimes, and that can be frustrating. So that's why we're starting so slow, we're starting so small. I've just given you these 3 pages, this preface to read. And if you think about the goal of a preface, if you think about what a preface does, here is an author's chance to do really a couple of things. First, they're going to set up their project. They're going to tell you, sort of give you a context in which their question and their problem makes sense. You know, you come to a book, and why was this book even written? A preface is a way to tell you that. Second, beyond that, a preface will give you a general sense of what that project itself is. So it's not going to do that project. It's not going to actually solve the problems, but by the end of the preface, we should have at least a sense of what Kant is trying to accomplish in this book and why he's trying to accomplish it. So this preface, these couple of pages, we're going to move through nice and slow, and if we do our job correctly, it will then just set up the rest of the book for us. It should make reading all the rest of it just so. Now, typically, as we're going through these lectures and these slides, I hope you have the reading out with you. But even if you're not typically doing that, let me really encourage it in this case. I'm going to work my way through, especially just this first page of the preface, fairly slowly, almost sentence by sentence in some cases. Again, to sort of really give you the sense of what Kant is saying and how he's saying it, so that as you read more of him, it's going to get easier. But here in this very first paragraph of the preface, notice Kant starts off with this distinction from ancient Greek philosophy. But of course, if you look at the rest of the page, what does this have to do with anything? In the preface, setting up this context, Kant is really thinking about the kinds of things that we can know, the kinds of things that we can have good, rational knowledge of, what Aristotle in the last section called episteme. So thinking about the kinds of things that we can have knowledge about. Once upon a time, of course, there was no such thing as modern science, as I told you with Aristotle. Really, if you go back to the Greeks, it was all sort of philosophy. So I want you to notice that over this page, Kant is going to use these 3 terms more or less interchangeably: philosophy, science, and rational knowledge. So to get a sense of what he's doing here, I just want to draw this box, and I just want to call this box all rational knowledge. But where you see Kant talking about philosophy, as he does in this first paragraph, or science, let's keep these basically interchangeable. So what the Greeks have done, Kant tells us, is to divide philosophy, or divide the kinds of things we can know about, into 3 major categories, 3 major types of our knowledge. And he'll call this logic, ethics, and physics. Now, again, these are general boxes, such that, by physics, we don't just mean what in modern language is called physics, right? So this is any of these kind of, science is looking at the world, ethics, obviously doing something different, and logic. But notice Kant says this is how the Greeks divided up their knowledge, and he says this distinction basically works. He says the distinction is perfectly suitable to the nature of the thing. What we need to do, he says, the only improvement we can make is to supply the principles on which it's based. In other words, okay, let's keep this threefold distinction, but let's explain why it's divided like this and how something gets classified into one rather than the other. Now, Kant is going to go on to make another distinction here. So after we've divided knowledge into these 3 big categories, Kant will now say all rational knowledge is of 2 kinds. Either it's material or it's formal. And so here we want to make a distinction between two kinds of knowledge. And here's where it's going to help to really explain what the difference is between material and formal. Formal, we think about a formal dinner or formal attire, but this can be misleading. Formal doesn't mean polite. Formal is having to do with form. And so, a formal attire, for example, there's really not any content here. It's about, you're not showing off who you are or expressing yourself. There is a sort of a structure that's applied to everybody. Black tie means everybody shows up in tuxedos. So formal here refers to form or structure, and there is knowledge, Kant is saying, that is strictly formal, knowledge of form. And so if, for example, and the example that I'm going to choose just comes from poetry, if you know what makes a haiku different from a sonnet, that's not to say you know specific haikus or you know specific sonnets. What makes the two of them different are formal rules. Right? So all haiku are going to follow the exact same rules. All sonnets are going to follow the exact same rules, and it's by following those rules that they come to be the kinds of things that they are. So the knowledge you might have of what makes a sonnet is strictly formal knowledge. It doesn't give you knowledge of specific sonnets, it gives you knowledge of the structure of a sonnet. Likewise, if you can remember back to your PHI 105 course, that logic and knowledge course, any of that formal logic you might have encountered, that's all strictly formal. So I've given you here an example of a basic formal logical syllogism. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. And so, those of you who can remember back that far should remember this is modus tollens. Modus tollens is a valid argument structure, but again, this doesn't tell you anything about the world. It doesn't tell you anything about A's and B's, right? We're not talking about the letter A. We're not talking about things in the world called A. These are what in math you would call variables, right? So the kind of knowledge you're getting from formal logical analysis is just this structural knowledge. So when we look at formal logic, what we're asking is the structure of this argument valid, right? And so again, if you can remember from logic and knowledge, the distinction between validity and soundness, right? Validity is strictly structural. If all of these premises are true, they will produce a true conclusion. We don't know whether or not they are true. If we're going to add the requirement of truth, we've got to look at content, which is going to carry us into soundness and material. So formal is having to do with form or structure, as opposed to material knowledge, Kant says, is knowledge of sort of content or specific objects. So again, if you read 3 different sonnets, formally, they have the exact same structure. From a formal point of view, all sonnets are the same. They are all sonnets. They all follow the same rules. Different sonnets, however, are different from one another because there are different specific words chosen for those poems. And so that difference is a material difference. It's the content difference. And so Kant is saying all knowledge then is either knowledge of structure or knowledge of content. And again, we get that same distinction preserved in logic between formal and informal logic, between validity and soundness. So, notice that Kant is going to make this distinction between formal and material knowledge, and he's going to show you that all formal knowledge is logic. And so, in this second paragraph, where he says, all rational knowledge is either material or formal, he will then go on to say, the exact same paragraph, formal philosophy is called logic. So formal knowledge, knowledge of structure, not content, that's what he's calling logic. Material philosophy, however, he says, is of 2 kinds. It either has to do with determinate objects and the laws to which they are subject, and these objects will, of course, be of 2 different kinds themselves. The objects are either laws of nature or the laws of freedom. So the science of the laws of nature, he says, is physics. The science of the laws of freedom, he says, is ethics. So again, both of these will be material philosophy because these are specific objects and specific laws. Moral concepts need to have content to them. They can't just be formal logical abstractions. Likewise, natural laws have to have specific content to them. They can't just be logical abstractions. So here we've got specific material content, but depending on what kinds of objects you're looking at, they are of two kinds, either ethics or physics. Kant will now go on in paragraph 4 to make yet another twofold distinction. So again, thinking about all rational knowledge or all philosophy, he says we can call philosophy empirical if it's based on grounds of experience, or pure if it is rooted in a priori principles. So again, let's go through this distinction, because this distinction will also divide all of our possible knowledge into two boxes. Empirical, from the Greek empyreia. So if you've done empirical science, for example, here are claims about the observable world or descriptions of experience. I want you to think about biology as just a good example for us. Not all empirical knowledge is biology, but biology is absolutely an empirical science. When a biologist wants to know something about the world, they have to go out to the world, look at it, and what they are doing is trying to give you a description of the way the world is. If a biologist says something and we want to know whether or not it's true, we've got to go out to the world. We have to experience that world. And so the claims of biology will only be true or false in the specific world where the biologist makes that claim, right? So if a biologist says a cat is a mammal, that is only true if we are living in a world that actually has cats in it, and those cats are actually mammals, right? So you can imagine a fantasy world in which cats are lizards, or in which there are no cats, and our same biological knowledge would not apply in that world. On the other hand, what Kant is calling pure knowledge here, what he says a priori knowledge, a priori, Latin for before experience. But in this case, it's not so much that it's before or after experience, it's that it is independent of experience. So, claims, I've said, whose truth are independent of the world, truths rooted in the nature of logic and reason. And so, for example, if you picture a triangle in your head, you are not, the claims you can make about a triangle aren't just claims about specific triangles in the world. Right? They apply to any and all triangles because a triangle in this sense is a logical abstraction. The triangles you find in the world, you don't learn things about those triangles by researching those specific triangles. You know things about those triangles because you can derive it from just the definition of a triangle. And so, for example, if you know the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. This is not something that you have to go out and test real triangles on the world to see if it's true. You know just from the definition of a triangle that this is the case. And so when you find a triangle in the world, you already know what is true about that triangle. Because if this really is a triangle, these rules have to apply. We don't learn the rules from the objects, we apply the rules to the objects. And if you think about the way math works as opposed to biology, this is that important distinction. A biologist, as I've said, in order to learn new things, they are going to have to go back to the objects of their study. So if you want to learn something new about a cat, something nobody knows about a cat, you're going to have to go research cats. And likewise, the claims you make, in order for us to know if they're true, we can't just think harder about cats. We will also then have to go and look at those cats and see if what you've said is actually true. So the description has to always be tied to experience and possible experience. And if all cats were to suddenly disappear tomorrow, just vanish off the face of the earth, then we would not be able to learn anything new about cats anymore, because the object of experience would be gone. By contrast, if you think about the way a mathematician learns new things, and of course mathematicians don't even say they learn new things, they'll tell you they discover things. And so a mathematician will discover a new proof as opposed to learning a new proof or inventing a new proof. And the idea is that it's a discovery because math and logic, these structures already exist. These concepts already fit together in a certain way. And so when we learn new things about math, we don't go out into the world to research numbers. We pull back into our minds. So what a mathematician is going to do, he's not going to, get research funding and go out into the field. He's going to sit down at a table with some pencil and paper and just think harder about math. And you go into the mind as opposed to out into the world, because this is what Kant is calling pure reason. The word pure just meaning, there's nothing in there that isn't itself, right? So pure water doesn't have any mud or mercury runoff in it. It just has water. Pure cocaine, right, only has cocaine in it. So it's not that pure means good or bad. It's just pure means unadulterated. There's nothing else in there. Pure reason is only reason. It's not adulterated by experience. It's not added on to experience in this case. So we're making another twofold distinction through knowledge, and you'll notice that, Kant will come to qualify this in a second, but this is going to split these boxes right down the middle. So ethics will have a pure part and an empirical part. Physics will have a pure part and an empirical part. That said, as Kant says at the very beginning of paragraph 3, logic cannot have an empirical part. And if you've been following me so far, it should be obvious why. We don't learn new things about logic by going out into the world. We apply logic to the world. And so logic and math for Kant both work very much the same way. They are things that we apply to the world and apply to experience. They are not things we get from experience. So formal fallacies and validity, you don't figure out if an argument is valid by looking at its content or by going into the world to see if it holds up. You look at its structure. You just think about logical structure. By contrast, of course, ethics and physics will both have a pure part and an empirical part. When pure philosophy is merely formal, Kant says, it is called logic. So this right out of paragraph 4, and again, this simply shows us that our box so far is correct, right? We have a formal section, we have a pure section. Where those two line up, we've got it labeled logic. If pure philosophy, on the other hand, is material, or as Kant puts it, restricted to definite objects of the understanding. And again, definite objects. These are not indefinite objects. These are not variables. These are not formal abstractions. These are definite, specific objects. So, where pure philosophy is applied to material content, specific content, definite objects of the understanding, Kant says it is called metaphysic. Now, this is important because Kant writes like a lawyer. And what I mean by that is Kant is going to use technical vocabulary, technical language, and he's going to tell you exactly what he means by those words, and he will only mean that. And so if you've been through other philosophy courses, metaphysics could mean a bunch of different things to you, right? We're going to prove the existence of God, or we're going to, undertake Descartes' project of radical skepticism. Never mind what else metaphysics means out in the world. This is all Kant means by it. Metaphysics for Kant is pure material philosophy. So material philosophy, looking at specific objects, but pure. We're not looking into the world for those objects. We are looking into reason for those objects, into the mind, into the concepts themselves. So this means, now of course in paragraph 5 Kant is going to tell you sort of, the empirical part of ethics is called practical anthropology, as opposed to the metaphysical part of ethics is a metaphysics of morals. And this is just to say, this is Kant setting up his project for you, telling you exactly what he is trying to give you a foundation for in this work. If a metaphysics of morals follows this chart, then what this means is that we are thinking about the specific concepts, the specific objects of ethics. So for example, what does good mean? What does right mean? What does wrong mean? If these are to be specific ideas, in other words, if they're not just variables, if they don't just apply to anything, and they should be, right? There should be some specific difference between right and wrong, or else there just is no right and wrong. So, what we need is material philosophy of ethics. We need these to have specific content, but Kant is saying we're not going to get that content by going out and studying the world and what happens. That's practical anthropology. Morals must come from pure philosophy. Now, why is that? Well, the problem is morals have to be applied to experience. We don't get them from experience. And so, for example, if you were to walk into a room and see one person punch another person in the face, this is what you have observed, right? This is what you have experienced. This is what you see to be happening. But in order to know if this is right or wrong, you can't look at what happened to figure it out. You have to be able to apply some evaluation, right? And so our values are evaluative because I look at the facts and my values help me evaluate them. And so for me to say hitting people is always wrong, that's not to say people never hit one another. It's just to say that when they do, they are doing something wrong. So Kant is saying we can't get these concepts from experience. We have to apply them to experience. Therefore, these specific concepts must come from pure reason. So, we now have our account of metaphysics, what a metaphysics is going to do. A metaphysics is going to give us material, pure knowledge, pure rational knowledge. And so a metaphysics of morals, we are going to try to discover the content, the specific content of morality within reason, within the nature of reason and the concepts that we all have to use in order to think about the world. Kant is therefore going to try to show you that by looking to reason, you will find these values and these evaluative categories that we can then apply to experience in the world. So I want you to turn now to page 3. At the very end of the preface, Kant gives you a quick layout of the book. So again, this is part of what a preface does. You now know what Kant is trying to accomplish in this book. You have a context for sort of where this problem crops up. And now he's going to give you just a quick overview of the book. I have not assigned to you section 3 of the book. I haven't even given it to you as part of your online reading. If you go off to grad school and you end up reading a bunch of Kant, then I think you'll end up getting around to reading it, but it's just not necessary for the purpose of our course. The first section, Kant says, is a transition from common rational knowledge to philosophical knowledge. Now, what does common rational knowledge mean? Really take that common seriously. He means common to all, which is to say, all of us, if we are rational creatures, right? If we are humans, and if what Kant has said is true about metaphysics and pure knowledge, this means just built right into the structure of reason, the way you already think and understand the world, should be moral content, specific moral content. In other words, Kant is not looking to teach you anything about morality in this book. Kant will not be looking to teach you the difference between right and wrong. If he's right, then just as a rational being, you already have some sort of an understanding of that difference built right into the structure of reason. And so what Kant is looking to do is just start by showing you, just pointing out the way we do already talk about morals, the way we do already judge morality, whether you're aware of it or not. And so that's to say, the job of philosophy for Kant is to clarify for us, to be more explicit about what we're already doing, And so I go out into the world and I have just sort of these intuitive judgments about morals, but I may not be aware of how I'm arriving at these judgments. And so philosophy's job here is just to be more careful and explicit and try to lay out carefully how we're doing what we're doing. And so the purpose of the first section is just going to be to develop some concepts and some terminology that we can use then to really carry out this project. So the first section of the book still isn't going to give you Kant's answer. It's just going to allow Kant to have a more careful conversation. So this first section, the section you'll read for the next time, is going to begin with just your basic intuitive judgments of right and wrong. So as you read Kant, you shouldn't have the sense of learning that difference. You should just have a sense of having it pointed out to you. Oh yes, that is what I think. Oh yes, that is how I tend to judge. But then over the course of that section, we'll develop a specific vocabulary that will allow us to ask better, more careful questions to really get into the meat of the project. And then, of course, the meat of the project, Kant is looking to identify the supreme principle of morality, which is to say, we want to know what is the difference between right and wrong. What should I do? What is right? In order to do that, we need to take the very careful questions and concepts we've developed in the first section, that philosophical knowledge, and then use that in order to access a metaphysics of morals. And so if you've been following along with the preface, you now know the project Kant is trying to accomplish. He's trying to look not to the world for the content of morality. He's trying to look into reason for the content of morality. He's trying to discover that supreme principle of morality within reason. You may not yet know how he's going to do that. How is he going to accomplish this? But you should at least now have a sense of what the project is. So keep this in mind as you move into the first section. And again, in that first section, just let Kant show you the kind of things that we already do think and say, and then move from there into kind of a more precise definition of terms that we can then apply to really get into the meat of Kant's project in that second section.